wanted to do a video on what yarn to use with what loom. I see a lot of people asking questions, how do I know what yarn to use with what loom? So I did a few swatches and I thought this might help you, and I already have one video on loom gauge, but it really pertained more to loom gauge, and then I did one on yarn and the differences in the weights of the yarn. So I thought I would put those two together and kind of combine them and make suggestions. Now, these are my personal suggestions. You can do whatever you like. Everybody has different preferences, but I'm going to try to give you some guidelines to go by. So let's start with looms first. So the looms that you will find at Michael's will be something like this. So this is what people know as the 36 peg loom, and this is what people know as the 41 peg. Very common. Loops and Threads at Michael's makes them now, and they're a little different. This is a really old one, but now I believe the pegs are set more to the inside and they're easier to put your loom hook in, because before you would end up with the nifty knitter looms like this one. I don't know if you can see. So you have these holes down here, and what a lot of people don't like is when you go to use your loom tool and you go to get the yarn, look what happens. My pick gets stuck in that little hole. So what Michael's has done with the new design for the loom is, see how it just slides off? There's no hole for it to get stuck in. And the new one, this is an old one. This is not the new one, but this is the first one that they designed that was a little bit better. So see, my hook doesn't get caught down there in that little hole. So this is a really good design. Okay. So the gauge for this, which means the distance from the center of this peg to the center of this peg, is 3/4 of an inch. This is considered extra large. This is the same gauge. The 41 peg and the 36 peg are the same gauge, both 3/4 of an inch. So you're going to need to use 2 plies of a worsted weight or a really heavy 5 or 6 bulky weight yarn for this loom, okay? This is the original purple nifty knitter. No, you cannot get these anymore. I got this one probably 5 or 6 years ago. Cindy Wood, which is what this brand is, makes this exact same loom with the same peg spacing and 48 pegs. You just have to order it from Cindy Wood Looms. This is a Cindy Wood, but it is a 44 peg, which is just slightly smaller than 48 peg, but it has the same peg spacing. This one is a 1/2 inch between pegs, and so it's a little bit smaller peg spacing than the 5/8, okay? So we have 3/4, which is the big ones, the 36 and 41. Then you go to 5/8 spacing. Then you go to 1/2 inch spacing, and then you go to 3/8. That's the smallest I have. They actually go smaller. They actually go to 1/4. Or a lot of people now have these new nice round looms that are also 3/8 of an inch. All right, that being said, now that we talk about looms, let's talk about yarn. I've taken some of the guesswork out of it for you. So I took the extra large, the size loom, and I took 1 ply of Red Heart Super Saver, which a lot of people use, a lot of loom knitters use. And let me show you the difference. So not only does the loom gauge matter, but the type of stitch you use also matters. Denise at Loomahat has a really good video on the 4 different types of knit stitches. This one that I've done here with 1 strand on the very largest gauge loom is E-wrap. It is the stretchiest stitch, and you can see if you made a hat with that, if you want it to look like that, that's great, but if that was not your intention, you're going to get a very airy hat. Okay, then I did what's called a U-wrap stitch, and the U-wrap is just simply, putting the yarn. So if you're not familiar with U-wrap, you're just wrapping it like that, and then you'd lift it over, okay? So this one has the U-wrap. I kind of did these backwards, and I did the U-wrap for a few rows, and then I did the true knit stitch, was the very last one that I did. So you can see when I pull these apart, There's still a little spacing, but nothing like the E-wrap. In needle knitting terms, this is actually called knitting through the back loop. Okay, I'm not a needle knit expert by any stretch of the imagination. You can see that the U-wrap and the true knit stitch, which is basically the opposite of a purl, are really similar in their stretchiness and what they look like. But you can see here the big difference in the E-wrap stitch. So if you wanted to do a hat with one strand of Red Heart Super Saver on the large gauge loom, it's going to be a smaller hat if you use this stitch, okay? Because it's not going to have as much give. So if you were making an adult hat and you wanted to use this U-wrap stitch, I would use this 41 peg loom, because it will end up being a lot smaller with this stitch. Because a lot of people say, oh wow, this loom is really big for a hat, and I agree it is, but I do know people that prefer this size of a hat. So if you were to use the U-wrap stitch on this loom, you would probably get a finished hat somewhere in the neighborhood of this circumference size. Does that make sense? Okay. Next yarn that's pretty common that I use a lot is Charisma from Loops and Threads Michaels. Okay. And so if we look on the recommended needle size on this one has 9mm US 13s. Okay. And like I say in my other video, not all number 5 yarns are the same. So see how it says it's a number 5 there, bulky? Okay, some number 5s are bulkier than others. This is homespun. This is also a number 5. Okay, it's also a number 5 yarn. All right, so on the Charisma, I did a couple of things. I did a sample where I did E-wrap knit right here. So you can see it's a bulkier yarn because it's a number 5 instead of a number 4, which is what Red Heart is, Super Saver. And I did this stitch. So if you did this stitch on the large loom and you ended up pulling it apart, when it just sits like this, it looks pretty good, okay? Doesn't have a lot of space. If you start to pull it apart, it has a little bit more space, okay? Then on this one, I did it a little backwards from the other one. I did the true knit stitch here, and then at the very, very end, I did the U-wrap stitch. Okay, still not a whole lot of difference, but see how much tighter that is? And you can really see how different, because this is called the twisted knit stitch in knitting. So it's twisted knit or knitting through the back loop, which is vastly different from the true knit stitch, or the U-wrap stitch, which the U-wrap is going to be slightly tighter. The true knit stitch is going to have slightly more stretch. See here how you have a little more stretch, and then up here you don't have quite as much stretch. So this is what the Charisma looks like on the 41 or the 36 peg loom. So then you say, well, what if I wanted to do something other than just straight knit stitches, okay? And I did a sample of a rib stitch. So in other words, one knit, one purl, one knit, one purl, one knit, okay? So this is your knit stitch on the extra large gauge. Then I did this with the true knit stitch and the flat knit. You can see how here you can really see how the true knit stitch is quite a bit bigger than than the U-wrap. So the U-wrap, it tends to get a little bit smaller. So there's your rib stitch with E-wrap. This is your rib stitch with true knit. This is your rib stitch here at the very top with U-wrap. Then I did garter, doing one row of E-wrap, one row of purl, one row of E-wrap, one row of purl, and it's that size. Then I did the garter with one row of U-wrap, one row of purl, one row of U-wrap, one row of purl. And you can really see the difference here. See how much bigger this stitch is, and it's going to have more stretch than this one that's U-wrap. So now that you can see how the different yarns look on the different looms, that gives you a better idea. Like I said, if you use the U-wrap and you use the large gauge loom, you're going to want to use a bigger loom because otherwise the hat will be too small for an adult. This is why I really, really like the 5/8 inch gauge loom because it makes a really nice adult hat. I can do an E-wrap on here and it's not too airy, but it still works up pretty quickly. So I really like this loom. This is my loom of choice for an adult hat. I like using Charisma. I still do use, if I'm going to use a Red Heart Super Saver, I use 2 strands held together. The only time you would ever use, or that I would ever use 1 strand, is if you were using the small 3/8 inch gauge loom. That's the only time I would personally use that. Now, if you use the Hometown USA, which is a number 6, okay, so this is a little bulkier, or you end up using one of the Bernats. This just happens to be the baby, but they have really nice regular adult colors in this yarn too. This is also a number 6. And these work up really well on this 36 peg. And if I'm doing chemo caps for adults, the Bernat yarn ends up being very, very stretchy, and it works up really well on this size loom. Now for me, the Charisma, which is this one, and the homespun, because I make a lot of hats that combine either Hometown USA and homespun or Charisma. And then this I actually like better than homespun. It's a little easier to work with, and it's not nearly as fuzzy, and I think it probably washes better. This is Country Loom from Michaels, so it's Loops and Threads Country Loom, and I've started to like it a lot better than homespun, and homespun has gotten really expensive. I think a skein of this now is around $7. So unless you, and you can find it on sale for usually around $4.99, $5. The Country Loom you can find on sale a little bit cheaper at Michaels, and I really like it. So personally, this is just my opinion, if I'm using a number 5, such as Charisma, I like to use either the 5/8 inch gauge or the 1/2 inch gauge. I really like the way that looks. I don't really very often use anything larger than that. You can use, definitely can use the extra large 41 peg or 36 peg to do Hometown USA. And that'll look okay if you're going to do an entire hat in this. It will look good. It doesn't have a lot of stretch. So that's the other thing you need to know. Each yarn has different stretch. This Charisma, this stretches like crazy. So you can make this on a relatively small loom and it'll stretch out for a much larger head, whereas Hometown USA does not have as much give. And the only thing I can tell you is that it takes a lot of trial and error, because mostly how I figured this out is through trial and error myself. All right, so let me show you a couple of hats I've made and what they look like and what looms and yarns I've used. Okay, I'm gonna go through a few hats that I've made. So this is my Quick and Cozy Chemo Cap, which a lot of you have already made. So this is Hometown USA on the bottom, and this is homespun on the top. I made this on the 44 peg Cindywood loom and 5/8 inch, I don't know why that's so hard to say, spacing on the pegs. Same as the purple 48 peg, okay? This is just what I choose to do for my caps. However, this hat would fit me, and I don't have a big head, but I have a lot of hair, okay? So you can see this is not terribly tight on me, all right? It's not terribly stretched out at all. And I did E-wrap on the top. This is a garter stitch, everything's E-wrap, E-wrap, purl, E-wrap, purl, E-wrap, purl around the edges, okay? So you can see how that looks. Now, this is Bernat blanket, and this makes really awesome chemo caps. This is 2x2 ribbing, so 2 knits, 2 purls using E-wrap, and then the top is just all E-wrapped, okay? So, and that's done on the 36 peg. So this fits really well. This stuff really stretches out. It's really nice and stretchy. This hat is this loom, okay? I'll tell you this before I give all these, send all these off for donation. Okay, men's hats. This is the Charisma yarn. I really like to use a smaller gauge loom with the Charisma. This is done on the 1/2-inch gauge loom. You can do it on 5/8 and it should look okay. I just prefer to do it on the 1/2 inch. So this is a 55 peg. I think now she makes a 56 and a 60, and a 56 would be a better option simply because if you're doing a pattern repeat, and I'll talk about that in a minute, it's divisible by more even numbers. 55 is only divisible by 5. So you can do a spiral with it though. Okay, so this is my guy's beanie, okay? And you can see, even though I made this on a little bit smaller loom, it has a lot of stretch. I mean, this yarn really stretches nicely. See, I want to put it up close so you can see there's not a lot of spacing or airiness to it. It's fairly, you know, snug and nice and warm. So I really like the 1/2 inch gauge for the Charisma, but I have made them on the 5/8 inch gauge. Now, the biggie. Okay, Red Heart Super Saver using 2 strands held together. I really prefer to make it on the 48 peg, and I'll show you why, especially if you're making them for people with hair. So this hat was made, this is the Diagonal Ice Beanie. You can find all these on my Ravelry page. And I just did a fold over brim, standard 2x2, so 2 knits, 2 purls. And then this is a stitch pattern. All right, I'll show you this one. So this one is snug, but not too tight. Okay, so I'll let you see up close what this looks like with the stitch pattern. Okay, once again, Red Heart doesn't have, Super Saver doesn't have a lot of give to it. Okay, now, same yarn made on the 44 peg, which if you're comparing it to a 36 peg is really close in diameter to that loom. Okay, so can you see it's not a whole lot bigger, it's just that these pegs are slightly closer together. Okay, so I did this one just to see what the difference was and how snug it fit on the 44 peg, which would be similar to the 36 peg. You can see when I put it on, it's a lot more snug. Okay, I'll let you look up close, see how far apart the stitches are. So this is 2 rows of E-wrap, then 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl for 2 rows, 2 rows of E-wrap, 2 knit, 2 purl for 2 rows, and then you just repeat that. This is 2 knits, 2 purls with a fold over brim, but you can see how much tighter this one is than this one. Okay, you can see that this one's a little bit bigger. Okay, so that would be the difference in using a loom that's larger in diameter with Red Heart, because it doesn't stretch. So the stretchiness of the yarn is a big factor. The stitch is a big factor. As far as if you want to see the 48 compared to the 41, you can see that the 41 is considerably larger. So for me, this is too big unless you're doing a U-wrap. I never use that loom. And it's 41 pegs. You can't, that's almost useless in a stitch repeat unless you're doing a spiral, okay? So real quick, I will go over a stitch repeat. So a stitch repeat pattern, for example, this one, this is a diagonal. So this has a pattern. So a stitch repeat means that, and a peg and a stitch I use interchangeably, peg, stitch. A stitch repeat means you're going to do, just as an example, 3 knits, 2 purls, 3 knits, 2 purls, 3 knits, 2 purls, and you're repeating that all the way around the loom. So you're repeating those 5 stitches. A lot of loom knitting or knitting patterns, when you're trying to create a particular look, say for instance a spiral, have to work out mathematically on a loom. It's the only constraint you have with a loom. Whereas when you're actually knitting with needles, you can choose how many stitches you want to cast on. With a loom, if you're doing a 6-stitch repeat, then a 44 peg loom will not work because you can't divide 6 into 44. However, you can divide 6 into 48. So that's why this loom is so useful, because 48 is divisible by a lot of numbers that are found in knitting patterns. Now occasionally you will run across a 10 stitch repeat, like there's a zigzag stitch that's a 10 stitch repeat that I really want to do, and you would have to do it on, you probably have to do it on one of these. There's an 80 peg one here. So if you wanted to do 12, you could use the 72 if you had a 12 stitch repeat. If you had a 10 stitch repeat, you'd have to use the 80 peg one, which is the extra large one. So I hope that's helpful in matching up your yarn with your loom. You can send me a message on Instagram or Ravelry if you have any questions at all and I can help you with any patterns. Please let me know. When you're making hats for people or you think you might be selling them at a shop or whatever, everybody wears their hats differently, and I laugh because I think it's just interesting that everybody has their own individual hat style. So if you give me a hat or a beanie, I live in Colorado, I'm doing this because I want my ears to be covered. I don't like my ears being cold. I don't like wind. I have a friend, if you hand her a hat, this is what she does. Okay, wears it on the back of her head. And this works really well. This is the 48 peg, the Red Heart Super Saver on the 48 peg. And this works really well if you're a back of the head person. That is something that you need to consider when you make hats for people. So do they wear their hat like that? Or do they wear their hat like that? So when you're making hats, how people wear them will affect how long you need to make them or how short you need to make them.